because today we begin a series of readings from the Gospel of John. If you remember, we were in Mark before. And this series begins with one of the most famous stories of Jesus, the feeding of the 5,000 plus people. This is the only miracle that is in all four Gospels. Now, last week in Mark, Jesus tried to rest a while with his friends, but he couldn't escape the crowds of needy people. And that's the same thing that's happening this week. The people have heard of these great signs that Jesus performed, and they want part of it. They want to be healed or fed or taught. And here, Jesus provides the entire crowd with food to satisfy their bodily hunger, and then they want more. They want to come and take him by force and make him king. And if you think about it, why wouldn't they want him as a king? He could make them infinite amounts of food. That's a good start. They think he's a prophet of old times. He is wise and he heals them. But no, says Jesus. And he goes up to the mountain alone. He isn't meant to be a king on earth. He isn't healing and feeding people in order to gain popularity. These are signs. John does not refer to the acts of Jesus as miracles. Rather, John uses the word signs. So that's what I'm going to say. Because a sign points to something, right? It sends you in a direction. In John, the format is this. Jesus does a sign, then there's a discussion of the sign, and then Jesus explains the sign. It's a three-part structure. So today is the sign, which is in two parts, the feeding and the walking on water. And the rest of chapter 6, which we will be reading over the next 5 weeks, explains the signs and talks all about bread. So I hope you like bread. We're going to hear a lot about bread. So what does the sign mean? These signs signify who Jesus really is. It's pointing to his identity as the Messiah, the Son of God. And the people think that he's meant to be a divine king, like David, like in the old days, or a great prophet like Moses, when he really is much more than that. The story today actually mirrors Moses' story. The sign that we have points to who Jesus is. In this version, Jesus himself feeds the people. He breaks the bread and distributes it. Whereas in all the other versions, the disciples feed the people. Seems like a small detail, but it's very important. Food is important because we need it, but also as a symbol, food is very important. If you read the Hebrew scriptures, which we call the Old Testament, before money was around, before money became the sign of wealth and abundance, it was food. Food represents abundance. And when God blesses people in the stories, they have feasts. They feel full. They go to the land of milk and honey. They eat the fatted calves. Meals were very important. And they're also very important today. When we gather around our families and friends to celebrate, is it around a pile of cash? Not usually. Usually some sort of meal, right? Sharing a meal is the ultimate sign of friendship and welcome and love. When someone comes over to your house, you usually offer them a snack. Now, this is why food miracles or signs in the Gospels are so important. They show God's abundant blessings upon the people. So in the Gospel of John, John is treating Jesus' story like Moses' story. John considers Jesus to be a prophet like Moses, but more. Which I know is a risky thing to say, greater than Moses, but we'll get there. When Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt, he led them into a desert, a place with no food. So the people were following him, and they complained that they didn't have anything to eat. So Moses prayed to God, and God sent them the manna from heaven. And they gathered it and ate it, and they were full. But then the manna would go bad. They couldn't save it, even though they tried. Every morning, more manna would arrive. Now here, the people follow Jesus into a place with no food. But he doesn't have to ask God for the food. Jesus himself makes the food appear, and it is not perishable. There are many leftovers to eat later. So Jesus feeds the people like Moses did, but the difference is that Moses had to ask God for the food, but Jesus is God. And we see this in the story through his actions. And this is what we get to see who Jesus is. Jesus is God. He is greater than. He doesn't want to be made king because his purpose is greater than. The walking on water portion of today's excerpt further shows that Jesus is God, and he actually says it. He demonstrates his power and says, "It is I, the great I am. Do not be afraid." He is revealing his true identity. Is he a prophet? No. Is he a king? No. He is the great I am. He is the Son of God and is God. So this bread discourse, as we call it, a lot of people dread the bread discourse every 3 years, but I love bread, so it's all good for me. The bread discourse continues for 5 weeks. So this week is the sign. Coming up, we're going to have an explanation and then discussion. And we're going to talk all about bread, the bread of heaven, the bread of communion, the bread of Eucharist, the bread of life. And we'll talk about resurrection and all that. But today, the focus is not bread, it's identity. These signs that Jesus performs point us to God. The signs indicate something about God's character, that God is a loving and not punishing God, that God's desire is to be available and accessible to all the people, not just the so-called holy people. Jesus is God. He is accessible and available to the people. He responds to the needs of the people who are around him. They needed to eat, so he gave them food. And we, as disciples of Christ, are to do likewise. We provide food, shelter, clothing, comfort, a friend, whatever is needed. And that's what Jesus and we respond to in the world, the needs that exist around us. We are to feed each other literally and figuratively, as Jesus did, reaching out in love, as Jesus did. Because we are not God, but we are Christ's hands on the earth. So God and Jesus feeds us by God's grace, mercy, care, steadfast love. And often we kind of don't see it because we get overwhelmed by life. So in Ephesians today, there's a great prayer that you should save your insert and highlight. The prayer in Ephesians asks that we may be strengthened in our inner beings with power through the Spirit, and that Christ can dwell in our hearts through faith, being rooted and grounded in love. That's a wonderful prayer, I think. If we can have Christ in our hearts and be grounded in love, then we can be filled with the fullness of God. It's a beautiful thought. If we let ourselves be filled with the fullness of God and God's love, make ourselves accessible and available, like Jesus, responding to the needs in our lives, as we are filled with the Spirit, we can help fill others with the Spirit. In love, always. And that's our true mission as followers of Christ. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.